Recently, I read an article that said Americans are rapidly losing faith. It was an article that wasn't bemoaning empty pews. It wasn't about lack of attendance at services. Rather, it was a comment made in a very non-judgmental way. It was a simple observation. And I have to say, I agree. But before you jump to conclusions, this is not one more rabbi getting up on Rosh Hashanah talking about why people don't come to services. I understand why people don't come to services. I understand why people don't want to sit and hear the words that our ancestors wrote that no longer speak to them. And I understand that. But that's not the sermon I'm going to talk about tonight. This was an essay written by Warren Buffett. You may remember it was in the New York Times. It sort of generated a controversy and a conversation. President Obama's referred to it. Buffett's position was, and is, that the super rich should be taxed. And given that he's a member of the super rich, his words had import. And in fact, his essay generated lots of conversation. I agree with what he wrote, his position on taxation. But I'm not going to talk about that either. Given that in our country today there is great economic disparity, and given that the super wealthy, like all of us, have a responsibility to maintain the country which has allowed all of us the freedoms and the opportunities we enjoy, it makes sense that they should be taxed. But I know that talking about economic policy and politics is way too polarizing. It's not a good thing to do on the high holidays. In fact, I learned about not talking about economics when I was a student at the Hebrew Union College. I still remember it was my senior sermon. And I was going to address a topic about how to buy property on the cheap, because in Hyde Park at the time, there was a halfway house and the housing prices were going down. And that was the beginning of my sermon. I was so excited. I thought it was wonderful. And I got up and I started to speak, and in front of me were the Board of Governors of the Hebrew Union College, the donor base of the college, a significant, and behind me was the president of the college, Alfred Gottschalk. And apparently he wasn't so thrilled that I began talking about economics with donors to the college. So I'm not going to talk about economics tonight. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about an observation that Buffett made. He said, Americans are rapidly losing faith in the ability of Congress to deal with our country's fiscal problems. We're rapidly losing faith in the ability of Congress to deal with our country's fiscal problems. What caught my attention was his use of the word faith. Faith is a word we usually associate in a religious context. Do you have faith or not? Faith referring to believing in something even when there's no scientific or factual proof for the position one holds, but rather believing because of tradition or religious perspective or what our parents taught us. That's what the religious person holds sacred. People hold things on faith because that's how they hope the universe works. In the face of uncertainty, in the face of doubt, particularly when things aren't transpiring as they want. For some, faith allows them to cope in a world which often appears chaotic, in a world that isn't fair. But Buffett wasn't talking about religious faith. He was talking about something much more straightforward. He was talking about trust in other human beings. A trust built upon verifiable facts, built upon observation. A trust that we could come to understand by watching people's behavior, seeing what they do and do not do. Buffett wasn't talking about religious faith, which easily divides and polarizes. He was talking about something very basic. To the people we turn towards in our lives and place our trust in, do they recognize? Do they appreciate what we have given them? Do they treat that trust and us respectfully? Do they hold the trust we have placed in their care and treat it preciously, or do they treat it shabbily? Buffett focuses his comment on the loss of faith on our political leaders. And he says what everyone knows, what most Americans at this time are saying, what we're saying. and that we're losing faith in Congress to deal with our nation's problems, our fiscal health, and all the problems that plague our nation. It's a frightening proposition that we would lose our faith in those who govern us. And our loss of faith stems from what we see. It is from direct observation that our faith is being shaken, because we see leaders who act more like children, squabbling rather than solving the problems. And surely with the 2012 election season beginning, it would be easy to rail against political leaders. How they've let us down, how they made promises they didn't keep, how they seem to be more concerned about keeping their jobs than they are for creating jobs of those who are unemployed. And it doesn't matter what side of the aisle one sits. Each side claims that the others failed, that we've been misled, that we've been lied to, that those politicians didn't live up to their billing. And if we're honest with ourselves, we'd even admit that our own, those we voted for, those we thought we could trust, have failed. It's always harder to admit that we lost faith in those we once had faith in. It takes some honesty to acknowledge that those we thought could and would haven't and don't. And while addressing a loss of faith in politics is an important part of our national conversation, for if we don't deal it, our nation will stumble, I'm not going to talk about that either tonight. And that's hard for me to resist. I like talking politics. But tonight's not about politicians. It's about us, ordinary citizens. It's about losing faith, not in those we see on the TV screens, but those we see sitting across the desk, or down the hall, or across the dining room table, or staring back from us when we look in the mirror. It seems to me that losing faith in other people is a painful and dispiriting experience, particularly those we interact with regularly, the people who form the context of our lives, the interconnected web of life which we live. Of course, proximity makes a difference, for the intensity of trust is not the same for all we encounter. There are those we encounter who are a bit more distant, and we keep a bit of a protective shield so we're not fully exposed, but we do expose ourselves some. And then there are those to whom we open our souls up completely, those who we give our trust to the depths of our being, unvarnished, unprotected, those who we believe will hold our trust as carefully as they would hold the most precious of possessions. Yet regrettably, all of us, at some point in our lives, have lost faith in people we trust. Some a bit more distant, some more intimate. We've seen people in our lives that we've looked up to and we realize that they've not lived up to our expectations. They've abused our trust. They've not met the kinds of hopes and dreams we had had for them. They had been less than we believed them to be. And when this happens, when we lose that trust, in an instant, the world changed. The person is diminished in our eyes. They stand not quite as tall. And when we listen to their words, we hear them anew and we wonder if they can be believed. And we wonder, too, were we wrong to place our trust, our confidence in another? And then we're wounded by those actions. Their misdeeds not only erode our trust in them, it makes us question our own judgment, question ourselves. Losing faith in another forces us to ask, how could I so misjudge that person? What does my inability to judge another say about me? Was I blind to their faults? Was I naive? Too willing to believe? When we lose our confidence in another human being, we lose a piece of ourselves. A small, imperceptible piece of our self-esteem is torn. It's weakened and it's eroded. And we become less than we have been. Perhaps even worse than losing our faith in another is when another loses faith in us. When someone who's looked up to us, someone who's looked up to me, sees that we aren't the people we lived up to their expectations, that we've fallen short, that we've missed the mark, whether in large or small ways, that we have in some manner failed a person who placed their trust in us, who placed their confidence, who placed their hope in us. And at such moments, we have to confront ourselves, our own actions and our own shortcomings, and admit our lack of will, our inability to live up to our own claims. In that moment when we have fallen short and be seen by another human being as not living up to their trust, it can be a profound moment. Frequently, we can remember the look in their eyes when they saw us for the first time as less than we have been. And we can hear how they spoke to us when they are crestfallen for our failure. That moment can live with us for years. There's disappointment echoing inside us, recalling what we did not do, that we mishandled the sacred trust another placed in our care. Perhaps at such moments, when we come face to face with the reality that others have lost faith in us, that we begin to lose faith in ourselves. A sad recognition that I wasn't the person I claimed to be, the person I wanted to be, the person I wanted others to know. And at that moment when we recognize not to be the kind of people we have planned to be. At that moment we realize how we're not living the lives we said we were going to live, or being the kind of people we said we were going to be. Living in a world without faith in others, without faith in ourselves, becomes a world without hope. For without faith that people, that we, that you, and you, and you, and you, and I, and all others can make a difference, that others can change the world. We've strapped weight to our legs, and we can say that the world can be no better. To lose faith is to give up hope. It's to give up hope that one day the world's going to be better. The children who are homeless won't have shelters again. To give up hope is to say that this is the best we can have and it only can get worse. To live without hope is to live in a world of despair. But fortunately, failure to not live up to our standards isn't a permanent state. If we have the desire, the character, and the will to act that reflects our better, nobler selves. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur mark the beginning of the new year. They're not magic erasers that erase the past or obliterate our past mistakes. No, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are a moment for us to consider, reflect, address, and attempt anew to repair the damage, to gain the trust, and to live up to the promises that we've made to ourselves and the promises that we've made to others. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur remind us we do not live in the past. We live in the present, and we plan for our future. Our errors may echo inside us, but they do not need to define our future actions if we have courage to admit when we faltered and the determination to reset our course. We must know that the human spirit is resilient. We are resilient, even when we may not feel it. Everyone has the power, the potential to move and rise beyond past missteps and regain trust. It may not be easy, and there may be some relationships that are so frayed that they can never be rebuilt. But the exceptions shouldn't come to define the common. Clearly, the history of humankind has tens of thousands of examples of human cruelty, of people breaking pledges, of deceit and distrust. We can enumerate them from here to tomorrow, to the next day, to the next. But human history isn't just about deceit and distrust. Human history has been populated as well by many more acts of kindness and generosity, large and small, moments that remind us of the power of the human spirit, the capacity. In the face of doing something wrong, people do what is right, even when it's difficult. Stephen Jay Gould wrote a piece after 9/11 on what he called the great asymmetry. He observed that every spectacular incident of evil will be balanced by tens of thousands of acts of kindness, too often unnoticed and invisible as the ordinary efforts of a mass majority. And I would add, for every misstep an individual takes, they also make hundreds of kind and generous acts that go unnoticed, often to themselves. Surely it's easy also for us to be cynical in the age we live in, when it seems that everybody wants to gain our trust for their own purposes, for our vote, for our money. An article in Forbes magazine sort of highlights that. It punctuated it for me. They wrote, "From love to business to politics, trust matters. There's no magic formula to building a trusting relationship, but there are a couple of tricks to help you gain trust in a hurry, even if you don't deserve it." It's easy to be cynical, but cynicism only leads to anger, frustration, eroding the foundation upon which hope needs and can be built. And within our lives, as we survey what we've done, it's always easier for us to see our shortcomings, to see our failings. It's so much harder for us to see the good that we have done. It's easier on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to recount our missteps. And it's difficult for us to remember the kind and noble acts that we have done. I know many people who make incredible differences in people's lives, but they don't see their own impact. They only remember what they've not accomplished, the missteps, the misjudgments. They think about the times they stumbled or fallen short. In their mind, they are full of negatives, though in reality, the positives in their lives outweigh the negatives a thousandfold. Too often, we think that taking pride in our accomplishments is some kind of arrogance or conceit, and coming to believe that we minimize ourselves, that's somehow better and that's more honest. We need to find a balance. We need to appreciate the resiliency in our lives, the kind acts and the generous acts we have done, and to recognize that we have the power to make a difference. People lose faith in us, and we lose faith in others, and we know that we can do better. We can do better. That's the message of the high holidays. That's the message that has echoed through the generations. Rabbi Nachman of Wroclaw asked, if you won't be better tomorrow than you were today, then what need do you have of tomorrow? The message of Rosh Hashanah is, if you won't do better next year than you did this year, why did you come here? Why do we pause? Why do we think about the year to come if we're not going to be better? That's what the new year offers us. We are not trapped in the past. It's the future that's stretched before us. We have the power. We have the potential. We have the resiliency to live our lives that is deserving of the trust that others place in us and we place in others. And when we live such lives, we restore faith.